instead, if you have the option, fine. And if there's a problem, if you're on a phone that can't do the long distance, let us know, because we can set up a toll-free line for you also in future webinars. So if that's the reason why no one's calling by phone, let us know. But it really would be a better connection for you. Get on your computer and have your phone be the way that you're hearing us, and then that way no feedback. Okay, so I got to mute Eric because I'm still hearing some background noise. There, that's better. Okay.
So this is Christy, and thank you, Will, for kind of getting us oriented and on the call. And for those of you who may have participated on the first webinar, this is an optional one for today, and we'll have an additional optional one in a couple of weeks. Part of the intention and hope is that with the future calls, we can kind of get this together in, a quick fashion early on in the call so that we can all be connected and hear each other and get right into the meat of the presentation. So I think we are almost at this point, so we really appreciate you all calling in a little bit early so that we could, make this happen. Are you seeing any other folks come on board that we need to welcome at this point or check audio? Looks like we've gotten through everyone that
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we're good. Let's go ahead and get started.
Yep. So today's webinar, and this is Christy Higgins, and again, I mentioned that you're going to see my name or my voice popping up as Tiffany Noble, who is not me, but whose account at this point is being used, I'm using at this point. So, but today's webinar is an optional webinar that Steve Roussos will be leading for us. That's on open space and open space technology training in the Health Equity Leadership Institute. And for those of you who participated in the statewide kickoff, you had an opportunity to actually engage with us collectively in our process of using open space as a process for us to do some learning and action planning on the spot, but also to introduce it as a opportunity to use with your communities as we continue to move forward with firming up your aims and your initiatives. And so we are pleased to be able to offer this additional time and opportunity today to dig a little bit deeper into this technology and how it works and ways in which you might think about applying it into your work. So I am actually going to stop talking at this point and turn it over to Steve, who will go ahead and move us forward through the rest of the webinar. So thank you, Steve.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So I'm just doing a checklist. We have Monica, Janice, Tina, and Eric. Is that right? From what you're seeing?
And Cora Gonzalez.
And Cora, great. Okay. All right. And if more people join us, just let me know so I can know who's there in case I call you by name. So thanks, everyone, for joining us this Friday morning. I'm real excited that we can do this together. It's a small group of us, but it'll probably expand over time, I think, as more people get into this idea of open space. I'm going to go really cover some things that if you were at the kickoff, we didn't cover. If you were not at the kickoff, don't worry about it because that was a very small introduction. So I'll be covering things a lot more in depth today, but really not as much as you would if you went to get a formal open space training that would probably last a day to 2 days. And there are trainings all over the country that are happening all the time that if people like this idea, I'll probably be sending links from trainers who do this. I got introduced to open space as a community member. Our community was doing this to try to understand how academics at the university and community organizations could collaborate on addressing problems of our region, the Central Valley of California. And so we didn't have an answer. We were struggling for at least 3 years, and so someone said, why don't you do an open space? And I can tell you it was a very strange experience and a lot of nervousness all around. And then after we did that, I and others really saw the power of it, that it got regular people involved, and we didn't need experts to guide us all the time to do these kinds of things. and it created action. And so I went with other community members and actually received formal training in open space. Probably that was in 2008, and I've done about a couple dozen of these in our community in other parts of California. So I'm not an expert, but I figured it's probably worth sharing what I know with you, and then write down questions as we go. I wanted to give credit to these slides and presentations that are online. There are a lot of materials about open space online. I think I sent all of you some of my favorites. But you know, if you were to go online and see some of these, you're going to see partly what I'm showing you today. So I wanted to give credit to those. And the workbook, everything that's been created for open space since the beginning of the concept is all online. So if you do want more in-depth training, there might be some self-training that you'd be able to do. Our objectives are fairly simple. We're going to be having about an hour, maybe an hour, 20 minutes together. We can go longer if you'd like, but I try to keep it around that time. Including some conversation, and with the idea that you'll understand the purpose and the process of open space. I definitely
Welcome to GoToWebinar, Web Events Made Easy.
To do open space if this is something you want. So the approach that I'll be taking in this webinar is really thinking of each of you as a potential facilitator of open space. Now, when you decide to do this as a team, you may decide that you don't want to be the facilitator. But in terms of learning this approach and teaching it to others, it really helps if you think of yourselves, at least for this morning, as potential facilitators of an open space and how you would actually implement it and do it. Open space, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, started back in the 80s. It seems like a very simple concept and it's so powerful, but it really came out of the idea that when you go to conferences and events to be trained or learn things, that most of the ideas and problem solving and things that you learn happen outside of the actual regular event meetings. They happen in the coffee breaks, in the hallways, in the parking lots, and sometimes even the restrooms. So it was an inspiration from seeing that happen that led to this idea of open space that evolved over time. And it's trying to really tap into that natural inclination that we all have as human beings to problem solve and to work with others. Whether we like it or not, when we get together in the coffee break, people gravitate together and start having a conversation. And oftentimes, big ideas happen in those conversations. The open space technology really is a way to provide groups some way of conversation together. And oftentimes, you'll see the word transformation, because open space is more than just a dialogue. It's not a brainstorming session. It's really about figuring out who's going to take a lead as a community on something, what group of people are going to do that, and how are they transforming the way we look at a problem or a goal so we can actually make it happen. Because the only reason you would do open space, of course, is because you have a problem or a challenge that hasn't been solved yet. It's really designed to tap into, again, that natural inclination or that passion that we have for problem solving that oftentimes gets placed to the back when we have to do tasks and duties and regular activities and we do things day in, day out. We forget about that natural passion that we might have. It provides some structure, but really the idea of open space is more about chaos and that whole idea of being open to things to happen and not pre-planning the outcomes. So it provides you enough structure, and that's what we'll cover most of the days. So what is that minimum structure you need in order to really release the creativity and freedom that all of us have? And oftentimes, if it's a group that may have been meeting for years, either because they're part of an organization or because they're part of a collaborative or initiative, many of you in your communities may be in that situation where you've been meeting with the same people for years and possibly around equity and disparities issues. But open space does something very unique in the sense that as you're having this process, it really brings in new energy and revives the spirit of the group. I've seen that firsthand, and it's just marvelous. So you want to think about how these kinds of purposes of open space could be used by you in your Helly team locally. Margaret Wheatley comments that there's no power for change greater than a community discovering what it cares about. And truly, that is what open space is it brings people together in a shared space, in a sense of a community, and looking at something that they're passionate about, And it unleashes their energy to think of, what do we really care about? And just identifying that in a very raw and honest way seems to mobilize people like nothing else can. The conditions for using open space, and we're going to cover some of this a little faster because I'm going to cover it again later with examples and doing some problem solving with all of us on the phone. But open space is not a discussion that you have for everything you want to talk about in your community. It has a fairly specific purpose, and when people misuse it, then they think, well, it doesn't work, because of course it wasn't designed to do everything. You need to make sure that before you begin the open space process, you actually have a real issue of concern, something that truly matters to your community, that you'd like to engage, your organizations, your groups, something that's very urgent. You need to have diversity of players. Open spaces don't work very well if you just have a few people that may think alike and not be able to think outside the box. It really helps to think of who are the stakeholders around these issues or concerns we want to deal with. It often helps for open space to have a complexity of a situation or a problem. You probably would not do an open space for, what do I want to go shop at the grocery store? You don't want to do an open space for who's going to take care of the calendar next month. It's really designed for things that are complex problem solving with diverse groups. There has to be some presence of passion or conflict, and that's going to come something we'll go back to again and again, and you'll see why. That really you do not use open space unless there's some urgency and excitement about something, and sometimes that excitement oftentimes is actually seen in the form of a conflict. Open space is used when something needs immediate decision and action. The more immediate, the better. Ideally, it'd be something where you do an open space, and that same week you're taking action on something. The less urgency there is for action, maybe there's a timeline of a few months or a few weeks, 6 months, all of a sudden open space becomes diluted. So you want to do an open space and think of doing it in a way that it would be followed as immediately as possible by action or movement towards something that came out of that open space. And last but definitely not least, you do not do open space if you already know the answer. It's got to be something where truly you're going to be open to the idea that we do not have the solution yet, and we want to come together with a diverse group of stakeholders to think about what we might do. If you think you have the answer already, it doesn't work. So how would this apply to our situation with Heli? Just an example here, there's many ways we could do that. So what's a real issue of concern? Key stakeholders of health inequities are not well engaged by the Heli team. Those stakeholders might be community members, they could be county leaders, whatever it may be, but it's just an example that I'm showing you. In terms of diversity of players, to have that kind of an open space or solve this kind of a concern, you need counties, agency and institutional leaders working with consumers most experiencing the inequities. And having those players together could bring in all kinds of complexities in terms of language. They may actually all be speaking English or not, but they also have different professional language or literacy issues. There'll be power differences, competing needs, and probably incompatible demands. People want something that the other person really would prefer doesn't happen. It might get in their way of being productive. Presence and passion, and in terms of conflict, I'm imagining all of our communities where we have Heli have that kind of passion and probably some sense of conflict as well. And the decisions we need to make really should have been done yesterday. We know we've had inequities for too long. We know health equity is critical. And the truth is nobody knows the answers. That's really I think the great link between open space and Heli is that we're launching into something that's truly innovative nationwide, and we have a chance to explore possibilities here that really no one has yet done. The word chaos, and hopefully this doesn't, I can't see your faces, it doesn't scare you, but open space is about chaos. It is not about planning or having pre-planned ideas and agendas. It's really about creating the conditions where people might feel a little excited, maybe a little uncomfortable, but just there's energy there where you create creativity. And anything that may get in the way of that, as we look at how open space works, is dropped off. When not to use open space? Clearly when the answer is already known. And then as we talk about your role as a facilitator, we're also going to use the word sponsor. And the sponsor is usually an organization or a group of organizations that says we're going to host this. We're the people who are going to maybe provide some funding for food or bring people together. but it's not the facilitator. The sponsor is really a larger group of people who believe something that the issue needs to be addressed in the community. But if the sponsors or senior management think they already know the answer and they're just doing this to, make it a goodwill to hear the community, that's more of a brainstorming session. So you don't want to use open space for that. If the sponsor feels that they need to be in charge or in control, that there needs to be some element of control, open space is unlikely to work as well. And we'll talk about something called the givens along with the theme, where if you as a facilitator realize that the sponsor is doing this, but they're not interested in releasing some control about the solution and what happens next, then it's probably not wise to bring your community together on open space. It's only going to cause more trouble. Let me take a little bit of break here. So I don't know, I'm going to just go randomly and say, how about Tina? Tina, if you can I'm not sure if you're chatting or if you're on your computer, could we be able to say something about what you're thinking of using open space for? I'm not sure if is Tina chatting or who can see things on your end. There we go.
This is Christy, and looks as though Tina is unmuted. Can you hear us, Tina? And then also it looks like Lupe is joining us.
Is that Luis Garcia?
Okay. Well, how about should we try Janice and see if Janice can give us what her gut instinct is, what she thinks she would like to use open space for?
Well, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Because we serve the 3 cities, one of the things I thought of was to invite the delegates to talk about the unfunded men and women that they know of, because the population that we're trying to serve is men and women who come to our clinic who have no health insurance, and how to serve them other than provide them with community resources or to refer them to the greater Los Angeles County for services, because the services that we offer here in the 3 cities are quite limited. So one of the things I thought of was to bring men and women from Pomona, Laverne, and Claremont together to talk about what they think about how to better serve those men and women who are uninsured.
Great.
Because it's really about them. And when Tony and Remy and I had spoken last week or the week before, they mentioned that we could use the wellness center, and so I have the support of our upper management to do it. So the reason why we're participating is they've learned more about how to do it.
Great. That could be a very challenging, potentially conflicting, but exciting conversation. How do we actually provide services for those that are not funded, other than sending them away to someplace else or referring them to things? So
yes,
exactly. It's a serious challenge.
And Tony shared with us a couple of weeks ago that of the adult inquiry that we've just been recently doing over the last few months, 85% of the men and women who come in have no health insurance. So one of the things we had thought about doing is looking at copies of the inquiry to see where these men and women are coming from and go out to them.
Perfect. That's really good. I wasn't sure if we had Tina back on or if she was having a challenge in terms of chatting or anything there, but
Tina's having a challenge.
Okay.
You unmuting her yourself, and so she is said that she echoes what Janice just said.
Great. Okay, what about Monica? How about you, Monica? What do you think you want to use open space for?
We'll just
Monica may have the same challenge.
Monica to raise her hand if she comes back on.
Okay, that's fine. Well, all right. So maybe the rest of the folks on the phone, think about that as we go through these next few slides, and we'll take another break. But think about as we're going through what open space is and how it works of how would I use this? I think Janice gave us a pretty good example, a fairly specific example of something that I'm not sure who has a solution to, and it would take some clever out-of-the-box thinking and some collaboration to go through. So that was great. Okay, so now I'm going to show you briefly some examples of probably what people might be using open space in terms of heli. Oops.
Steve, Monica just raised her hand, so I'm going to ask her to share her question with us.
Great, thank you.
So Monica's question is gap and asset gathering of who, what, when, how to serve the Latino community is how she's considering using it.
Got it. So probably, you know, if there's within the community, if there's not enough ideas of how do you actually close these gaps in serving the Latino Hispanic community better, then bringing those stakeholders together to see what we actually do about it. That's good. That's very good. All right, let me see if my PowerPoint will move here down. There we go. So some other examples, and I think these are parallel what you've been giving me as examples now, is engaging the community-wide conversations and definitely cross-agency participation to define the purpose and direction of what you're doing. Depending on where you are as a heli team, you may already have some aims, or an aim rather, or not, but if you don't have an aim or you feel you need more clarity, it's possible that you might define it with an open space. Stimulating and sustaining leadership and innovation. So the idea of closing the gap in terms of services for Latinos would require quite a bit of leadership and innovation. So bringing people together to step up to the plate and think of what they could do. And really thinking of how you use open space to nurture existing and build new relationships. So the problem that you might be solving is one thing, but the process of bringing them together and building those relationships is equally important. The basic steps of open space, and you'll see manuals on this, in terms of just the nuts and bolts of it, is first establishing a compelling theme. So we talked about a couple of examples and some other broad ideas just now, but really honing down into a fairly clear theme is more difficult than you can imagine sometimes. It's really thinking of what communicates to people right away. Then there's the invitation process and finding the people that can come to your open space and engaging as many people as you can. Preparing the facilitator. For this webinar, I'm assuming you're the facilitator, so we'll talk about that, but preparing someone who is going to be fairly neutral and non-controlling, because as we talked about, open space is not about control. Creating the agenda and working sessions in real time. And so there's no agenda that's set out in advance. It happens in real time at the meeting. All you have is a theme and the people and the space. Then the participants actually implement the working sessions. And for those of you that were at the kickoff, you saw a little bit of that. Imagine if you were going to do that the whole day or for 2 days. You have several sessions happening at different times of the day, and people are running these sessions, and they're literally problem solving in groups. The reports are prepared in real time, and it's not as easy to see that. There might be some things on the web that you can see that, but most open spaces will bring note takers with laptops and actually be taking the notes in real time rather than paper, which you have to type up and put to the back, and it might take a lot longer. So having a pool of people who can also be quick typists, if they're paper there, or be typing in meeting notes is always fantastic. Disseminating the findings as widely and as quickly as possible, and then actually implementing the actions that come out of the open space. We'll talk a little bit about how you do that in terms of convergence and prioritizing, and then reflecting and repeating, not doing the open space as a one-time event, but thinking of how are we going to evaluate or measure if we're making progress based on the theme or the concern that we had. Pre-event planning, really the first step is thinking of, is this the right approach? And not making that as a single person. You as facilitators in this conversation would be working with a group of people that are probably represent your heli team and others, and having a dialogue and critiquing what you want to use open space for and whether this is the right thing to do. Naming the theme happens before the event starts, determining who to invite and how many people, setting a date, selecting the location and the space, determining what you're going to assess as outcomes. So, for example, is it innovations that come out of the open space, ideas of how to do something different? Is it the relationship building? Is it action plans for a policy change? Depending on what your theme is, it's important to think of what do we want to get out of this and do next from this open space. So you're not solving everything, but you do want to figure out how are we going to know that this open space moved us along the right path. You need a plan of strategy of how to engage people who can affect the event. Oftentimes when you do something like an open space, which is a very flexible, sometimes confusing event, if people haven't been part of something like this before, you want to make sure you engage people who might be afraid of these kinds of things or might cause problems in terms of saying, no, this isn't important, as well as those who are going to be your champions and really get people involved and get more people to come. And then last but not least is send out the invitations. So actually creating some kind of an invitation where either by email or in print or maybe even some phone trees, thinking of how you're going to get people there. The day of the event, and we'll cover these things in more detail, are preparing the sponsor, the person who's hosting the overall event, with an introduction. They'll open up the event and then the facilitator takes over in terms of facilitating the conversations. Setting up the space, and we'll look at some examples. Setting up a registration area, which many of you probably are familiar with in doing other events. Name tags, maybe some sheets to take notes, but very simple registration. Setting up the message area and the signage. There's 4 specific signs that often help in open space to get people focused on what this is all about. Computers, if you're going to have people taking notes. Making the room into a circle and putting the blank paper with markers in the middle. And then making sure that whatever the breakout areas are going to be, where people are going to go for conversations, you have notes pages there and markers or pens for people to actually take notes and document what was going on. The day after the event or post-event, again, sooner rather than later, is debriefing. You might debrief the same day after the event or nearly after the same week. Distributing the proceedings is critical by mail or by internet, posting them somewhere so people can see them. And that includes people who didn't come to the event. So you definitely want to make sure people who came to open space see them, but you want to think of how can we also distribute it to those folks who just for some reason couldn't come or didn't want to come for their own personal reasons. Thank yous to people who participated, and then implementing the assessment activities. When you decide to do the open space, how would you know that you're going to follow up and see if the open space facilitated the kinds of innovations or problem solving that you intended? How does it actually work in terms of the day? Fairly simple. We'll look at some examples. There's a blank wall in the room that's organized around as a circle. That's where the agenda for the meeting will be created and go. And really the heart of the day is about getting people to understand that it's about passion and responsibility. So people are going to be writing their names to something that they want to discuss or problem solve, a question or an issue. They will go up to the front of the circle and announce it, literally. People will decide whether they want to join something that they announced as an important topic or whether they want to join something else. Clearly, it is not brainstorming. So there's a responsibility when people start doing their sessions that they will document what's happening. They'll track their time if they promise that the session would only take a certain amount of time. And then oftentimes people use the term bringing back 3 pieces of gold. So thinking of how you're going to bring back at least 3 pieces of information around actions or ideas that are important for the overall theme of the working space. The open space approach has 4 principles, 1 law, and 2 animals. And for those of you that were at the kickoff, you got a sense of that. We're going to cover those in more detail now. This is a sizable open space. As you can imagine, this is a very, probably on the larger size, but you can see how the room is organized into a circle. In the middle, there's a box with yellow borders where the papers will go, where participants can easily go down the path. So you can see it's not a continuous circle. There's specific quadrants there that people can walk down and write their idea. And then around the wall, there's space where people will be posting their agenda and looking at what it is they want to go to. Now, you might have an open space with 5 or 10 people. You might have it with 20 people. Obviously, depending on what you're trying to address, you may have a much richer open space with more and more diverse people. So you want to think about that, but the arrangement of the room would look something like this. And here it is up. There's been open spaces that have been done with thousands of people, and then partly they work because people self-organize into smaller groups. Here's someone writing their topic that they'd like to have a session on. So the person who actually writes this topic down is what's called the convener or the host. So when this person writes their topic and then places it on the blank wall where it creates an agenda, there'll be a time on it in terms of when they're going to do this, when will it start, when will it end. Because remember, people are going to want to go to different sessions, so they want to know when are you going to talk about this topic. And then, of course, your name and the location. Some of that organizing in terms of location and time can be done in advance by creating a grid, and we'll look at an example of that. It's called the space-time matrix, where you list the locations that are available to you. If you're in a hotel, for example, it might be by the pool or in the lobby. If you're in a larger, maybe a school, you might have room numbers. And you would list times that throughout the day, and then people would pick up these sheets that this person is completing right here and just stick them into the right location time part of the matrix. When you list your session, you can come to the middle where that yellow square was, and ideally it's helpful if you have a mic if you have more than 10 people and the room may be a little larger, and the person reads out loud, reads what they're gonna what they'd like to see a session on, which they're gonna host. Here's the blank wall where people have this is probably room numbers here, 13, 14, 15. Sometimes if you don't have rooms, you might have a large room and you might separate it into quadrants and you'll put numbers on those quadrants or letters like A, B, C, D might be different corners of the room. And so you'll put those up on the white blank agenda area so people can know where those would be and where your topic falls. Here's an example of that space-time matrix, sort of the topic, the place, and the convener. And usually we encourage people to also, there's another sheet I'll show you where people write their names as they go, as they decide what they want to go to. People will sign their names on the white wall as well. It also happens when you go to the session as a note taker that writes down your name. People often find that very useful to have an idea of not just how many people went to what topics, but who, because open space includes a list of all the participants in the back of what's called the book of proceedings, all the notes from the open space. And people are often frustrated if they can't find someone that they talked to or they lost their card or something at the open space. So having those names in multiple places really helps. Here's people trying to decide what to do. So this was a pretty large group. You can imagine there are all these sessions on the wall, and literally right now, people are looking at the agenda and trying to decide what they want to go to. And this could take a few minutes. It could take close to an hour, depending on how large the workspace, the open space is. And it might be a 2-day open space, and you're just doing, for example, day 1 or the half day of the agenda. This one is sizable, so it might take a little bit longer. Around the wall, this is where the signage comes in, and one of the signs that's often put in an open space that you would facilitate are the principles. And there's 4 principles. Whoever comes are the right people. Whenever it starts is the right time. Whatever happens is the only thing that could have. And when it's over, it's over. The principle of whoever comes are the right people is really just that, is you can't be worrying about who came and who didn't come. Ideally, your invitation process would be broad and you'd invite a lot of different people. But once the open space starts, you're not going to be calling people up to get them there that didn't show up on time. You're looking again to work with people who are passionate and committed to what you're trying to accomplish. So there's no point in worrying about who's coming. You want to concentrate on those who are there and really make them feel appreciated and truthfully identify what they care about and honor their presence. We don't need everybody, just those who care. And this is sort of a bit of a subjective and tough statement sometimes because there's reasons people sometimes can't show up, and that's perfectly excusable. So you want to think about this in a bit more of a broad way, that we need those people who are going to care enough to show up. And sometimes people care, and for other reasons they can't show up. Are you alone in the open space? And not that people always enjoy doing an open space of 1 or 2, But obviously, it can be anyone. If you are the only person that's coming to your session, for example, let's say you nominated a topic on health equity that nobody else wanted to go to, and you really love that topic, then you would open space that session with yourself and take notes and document what you believe people should know about that topic. The next principle, when it starts, is the right time. Critical. I mean, really, this is one of the more important parts in terms of creativity, because you don't become creative at one time and not the other. Granted, some of us know when our high points of creativity are. Maybe they're 5 in the morning or 5 o'clock at night, but you can't necessarily plan for creativity. So you might be going to a session that you hate and you'll move on. It just didn't spark your creativity. Or maybe over lunch when there's no sessions, all of a sudden you get creative and you want to start a new session and start writing some things down. So whenever it does start is the right time. So if you're going to host a session, a topic, you might decide to do it at a time that's best for you and when you think is important, and then people will show up as needed. The clock clearly can get in the way. Many people avoid having clocks in an open space situation, and they walk around with small timers just to make sure people are in the right place in the right time. It helps to have a clock by the agenda, the white wall, but you want to be sensitive to the fact of not making this something where you're bringing people back every 20 minutes. You want to give them that flexibility. You want to focus on people being creative rather than looking at the clock. The next principle, whatever happens, is the only thing that could have. Coming back to the same idea of whoever shows up is the only people who might have shown up anyway. This is important in terms of letting go the expectations of what the outcomes should be. This may be the more difficult or most difficult part of conducting an open space for the first time. This principle takes some getting used to for many people, because we're used to having an agenda and completing the agenda within a certain time, or some kind of a facilitated meeting. And it's tough when you're not sure if you're going to get what you planned with your open space. Will it produce the results you wanted? Ideally, in most situations, it does because of the nature of how it's set up, but maybe it doesn't produce exactly what you wanted in the way you thought. Well, think about that. If you had those expectations and solutions in the first place, maybe you didn't need an open space. Critical to have a good facilitator who can raise the expectations of the group for creativity and passion, creating that environment where people feel like, wow, today I'm going to say something that's important and people will hear it. Today I'm going to learn something that's going to surprise me. So it is important to think of, if you're going to be the facilitator, how can you bring some of that enthusiasm into the room? And you do want to think of, in terms of whatever happens is the only thing that could have, is to trust the group to find its own way. To really trust the people who are going to the sessions and the overall conveners of the meeting, that they're doing as best as they can, and that they will find their way in whatever solution it is they're looking for. When it's over, it's over. So naturally, there are timelines. So if you decide that your open space will be a day, people might decide to continue having a conversation. But technically, in the actual sessions, the topics that people nominate within the open space, they may do it for 10 minutes. They may schedule it for an hour, but realize that they don't need an hour. The conversation's over in 10 minutes. So it is important to think of that there might be this time-space matrix on the blank wall, but that may change, and naturally, if it changes and you're the host, you would go back to the time-space matrix where your topic was posted on the blank wall, and you would say it's over, it ended. That way people are not still looking for it and get confused. So when it's not over, keep going. And this is also tough because we're all very good at, when the bell rings, come back and convene. But in the spirit of open space, if people take this seriously, they will continue talking and not necessarily come back when the time is up. So when you're scheduling and organizing your day or 2 days of open space, you want to really be sensitive to how much time do you want to allow. It's not fair to really leave half a day if you're going to discuss a very serious topic. Maybe you'll think of a smaller theme or a more compartmentalized theme for a half-day open space. But you want to respect that people have ideas, and it may take them more time to do this. So thinking about how do you connect the size of your problem that you're going to discuss with what's achievable for an open space is really important. Now we get to the laws, and the law of 2 feet may sound similar to the principles we talked about, that you are the only person that can decide whether you're learning something or not and whether you're contributing something or not. This, too, is something that takes a little bit of practice, and so when you first do open space, the facilitator and maybe a few others may want to probe for that or look for that. Look for people who might be sitting in sessions and not contributing. We'll talk about how that's okay as well if you're a butterfly or a bee. But you want to really infuse the sense among people that, look, if you're not getting anything of the session, don't stay there just to be polite. That's not what open space is about. Use your 2 feet and move to something else. Depending on your session, some people have also pointed out that this is something that, there might be someone who's a paraplegic and maybe can't walk, and so you may want to reframe this in terms of the law of personal responsibility. There's other ways of saying this, but the gist of it is move on if you're not contributing or if you're not learning. You're responsible to meet your own needs. So the host, this is the convener, sometimes called the convener or the host, offers a quick question, picks a time and a place, ensures the notes are taken in the meeting, and brings back 2 or 3 pieces of gold for the rest of the group. So think about it. If someone has an hour-long conversation, the accountability is to try to distill that into some pieces of gold or nuggets of ideas and information. It's not just to put all your notes up so people can say you were talking and that was nice. You really are, as a host, trying to guide the conversation in a way that says, what are we going to bring back to this group that will help address the theme? And it's really important to try to have somebody that's attending, if you're not having an open space session of 1, to also take notes, so that way the host can be more of that person who helps facilitate the dialogue. The participant's responsibility, and here's a small group, joins the group that interests them and leaves if they're not interested. They participate in the discussion. They can change their role to a bumblebee or a butterfly, which we'll talk about soon. And the most important part for the participant is to observe the law of the 2 feet. So the 2 animals, and there's actually 3. There's also a giraffe, but it doesn't get mentioned too often. So the 2 animals that symbolize what happens in open space, everyone can be a participant and a host, but you may also be a butterfly or a bee. And the bumblebees are the participants who tend to go to more than one session at one time. They're literally hopping and buzzing around from one conversation to the other. Sometimes people say, oh, that's terrible, it's disrupting my open space conversation, but realistically, the bumblebees have a very important purpose. They help to cross-pollinate ideas. So they might hear something in one setting that might be important to another session that's going on, and they can bring those thoughts and ideas there instantaneously. So think about that. It's almost as a real-time communication that is better than texting and better than email. You have a person who's jumping around because that's what they love to do from meeting to meeting, and bringing in ideas in across those different sessions. You might also be a butterfly. So the butterfly, if you can picture it, is a little bit different than a busy bee bumping from one place to the other. The butterfly tends to be quiet, may attend a session, or may just hang out in the hallway and think about things and bring ideas back to the group on their own. They might join the session and say nothing, but just watch. And then later at the end, they might either say something during the session or in the larger dialogue with the entire room. So these people are important because, again, like the bumblebee, they bring ideas to one group to the other, but they don't do it in such a proactive way. They're much more of the thoughtful, watching what's happening and maybe able to reflect and connect the dots in ways that no one that's in any session can do. Very powerful role for those people who are natural butterflies. Prepare to be surprised. So the butterflies and the bees and the law of 2 feet and the 4 principles, those are all signage, the basic signage that you would put into an open space room, and maybe around, if you were using a larger building, you might post those throughout the hallways. You want to use that signage as a way to remind people what this is all about. And it's often nice to have a sign or 2 throughout that says, be prepared to be surprised. You want to create that element that people are looking for something novel and different and something that will enlighten them. Let me stop for a second there because we're covering a lot, and now we're going to go into some things that are may take a little more thought in terms of your role as a facilitator. Any questions or anything that's come up to this point? Anybody?
Hi, Steve, this is Christy. One of the things that I know was coming up for me as you were talking was about the length of time as we think about these teams and their work with Heli and with the communities and that kind of thing, and using open space. They may not have, a full day or a couple of days to
I just wondered if you had any like specific or practical ways in which they might think about using this with their communities.
Yeah, we're going to cover that a little bit more, but I have been in situations when you get together with people and you realize you have something that really meets some of the criteria for open space, but not all of them. And one of the more challenging ones that I've been part of, and I know will probably come up for the teams, is that we're often used to attending conferences and meetings where many things try to be accomplished in a very short period of time, and we pretend that they're accomplished because the meeting was over, but really nothing was accomplished. And that's a skill and a habit that we've gotten in. In terms of open space, if you find yourself trying to have a theme that's so big that does not allow for the time that you believe it deserves to bring the people together, to have that dialogue for a half day or a full day, then really open space may not be the right tool. So you want to be careful about being very critical of, are we going to allocate the time necessary to have a discussion, a real open discussion about this where people can really reflect and think about it. The challenge with most brainstorming and convenings is that people never get a chance to truly reflect individually and with other people. And open space assumes that the only reason you'll do an open space is because you're going to allow that time. The trick is, are you selecting a theme or a concern that will be balanced with how much time you're going to leave to have a true conversation about that? Now, that would take some practice, but you can imagine if you had a Heli team that got together and really was sincere with themselves and put up a topic that, you know, we're gonna solve a major problem that hasn't been solved for decades, and we're going to solve it in half a day. If no one in that Heli team is going to be honest with themselves that that actually might require a 2-day open space, then they may be walking into the wrong thing. I know I'd be glad to help people with that. I mean, I've been through it enough time to help people with that specific aspect of this. Is as you come up with themes and thinking about the time, I'd be glad to help you as facilitators and other ways think about how you might balance that, because it is one of the more important things.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay. So the role of the facilitator. So all of you on the phone right now, I'm assuming, even though if you may choose at some point not to be, I'm assuming you're going to facilitate a meeting. Or you might help someone else facilitate a meeting, but you're for the purpose of the webinar, you're facilitators. And it's a fairly specific and simple role, and critically important that it's done in this way. Facilitation in open space is not facilitation that you'll see in planning meetings or meetings and things of that nature. The facilitator's primary role, as shown here, is to hold the space and the time. So in many ways, you're a mini janitor, moving around and making sure that the space and the chairs are aligned in some way, that as people have sessions and the room starts looking messy, maybe others can neaten it up again, that the signs are up, that people know where to go. You're really facilitating the use of the space that you have and the time, in the sense that there are sessions, some may finish sooner, some may go later. How are you going to coordinate, if, like Christy was saying now, if you're only going to do a day or a half a day? How can people be sensitive to that there may be some time requirements, given that they're very excited about their conversations? But that's really your primary role. You do that role by being completely present and absolutely invisible. If the open space happens well, people remember the facilitator because they obviously opened up the meeting with, here's how it works and an agenda. But then that facilitator becomes fairly invisible during the sessions. They'll see them going around and cleaning and organizing and maybe answering a few questions, but they're very invisible. But because they're invisible, it does not mean that you as a facilitator aren't present. You really need to be fully present and looking around to see how are people doing. Who may need something? It may be as simple as who may need a glass of water. Who's feeling tired and maybe you have to find a resting place for them. But trying to be a good host. And to do that, you don't want to just sit in the corner somewhere and read a magazine. You want to be fully present. You work with the sponsors to create the theme and the givens that we'll talk about in a bit. So the theme, again, is something that you as a facilitator should understand very well, because that's partly what you're going to be responsible as far as people have questions and you're trying to guide the, if people are asking questions of what is this and how does this work, you should say the theme today is this. You don't have to say that much. It's mainly just understanding what is that theme and what are the givens of the actual sponsor organization. You're keeping the space open. You're staying out of the participant's way as much as possible. You're focusing people on, are you talking about something related to this theme? It helps to go around and say, maybe this conversation is, you're not necessarily judging the conversation, but you're saying, how's your conversation going relative to the theme of today? People might actually have changed their session topic to something totally different than what they started with, but it's still related to that theme. And then you could find out and go back to the whiteboard and the agenda and write that down. And then following up. You want to follow up with the sponsors on what are the results. Do you feel we made progress based on where we thought we were going to go and what's going to happen next? Oftentimes the facilitator doesn't do that. The sponsors may let the process go. You don't have to worry about messing up. Again, you're not there to be in charge. You're there to be a good host, to make people comfortable and move the process along in a friendly and fun way. Explaining open space, explain as little as you can. The concept is fairly simple. Hopefully, if we talked about it now, it makes a lot of sense. It's designed so it can be done by anybody. Yes, you can pay professional facilitators thousands of dollars, but that's not the intent of open space. The intent of open space should be something that anyone could do. If you haven't experienced it, it won't make sense. It can't be said any more truly than that. I know my first open space was like that. You hear about it, you don't understand exactly what it's going to be, but you trust the process. And once you go through it, then you say, that's how it works. You go over the guidelines, what's appropriate for open space. You make sure the sponsors agree. Again, part of the role of the facilitator, if you're going to facilitate this, is you don't want to be caught in an open space where the sponsor wants to control the agenda and you didn't know that going in. And you're starting an open space that really should never have been started. So the goal of the facilitator is really to vet the process of, should you be doing an open space in the first place? And then telling your open space experience. If you've done this before, sharing some people like I did today, sort of what this was about and what you learned from doing this. To Christy's question in terms of time considerations, and I don't think these are rules that are fixed. These are just some ideas to think about in terms of time considerations. A half day, if you were to start at 8 with registration and go till about lunch, is really more about quick brainstorming. You may not get to the root cause of what people want to discuss, because in a half day, you might have 2 or 3 different sessions where people will host conversations. So there'll be action items that come out of there, but to get to the point where really you're thinking about those action items, prioritizing them, discussing next steps in terms of open space, hard to do when you only have a 4-hour block. One day you can get a good discussion and probably some next steps. What are we going to do? I've done quite a few one-day open spaces. Again, you start about 8 o'clock or so with registration. By 9 o'clock you're going, and you'll end somewhere around 3:30 for, again, if the energy disappears, you might end sooner, and if it goes longer, maybe you'll order dinner and continue going. But one-day open spaces are fairly common. 2-day and longer, you really start getting into deep exploration of things. I mean, think about at the end of one day, you're recapping the notes and what people have learned. You're coming back the next day and building on those and taking them further and further, and what do we want to do? So for the more serious issues, like how do we close the service gap for Latinos, you would imagine you'd get a lot more out of this if you could plan it for more than one day. These would be consecutive days. So you don't do open space in terms of doing it one day on a Monday and then coming back the following Monday. You do them continuous, or you have a smaller theme and go with something smaller. Location space is key. You want to think about larger than you need. You don't decide on the space based on just the number of people. You always assume you're going to have more. People bring friends. Granted, people will also leave, but you want to think of how do you plan for about a half of size larger than the group that you're inviting. You want to think about, is there a place on the room to organize it as a circle, to put up your blank wall in terms of your agenda, a newsroom where people can post their notes. Is it acceptable to put tape on the walls? You know, things that can be deal breakers if you get into a room that's maybe too pretty and too precious, where you can't move things around. That can cause trouble. Really, you're preparing for an all-day coffee break. You might have lunch. It's important to have snacks and drinks around, but people might be talking all day, and then that's why it really comes back to the idea of learning your best ideas coming out of the coffee breaks. It helps to have a copy machine, I've learned, or some way of making copies. I usually bring one of those portable, well, it's not portable, smaller fax printers with me, so you can make copies of things as you need them rather than running around and going into a different room. In this day and age, it does help to have the internet, especially if you're going to be taking notes and you're going to be sending them from one room to the other. Obviously, there's USB drives, but thinking about the process of what you're going to need for your location and space. The most important, though, is thinking of, do you have a large enough space, and will you have quiet enough areas for those breakout sessions? People have found clever ways to get around tape on the wall and putting up agendas, but you really can't get around the fact that you need a large enough space with enough places where people can get together and talk. The theme. The theme is key. Without a good theme, it makes the open space not as productive, and sometimes it can be more challenging for people to think about what they want to talk about and what they need if the theme isn't clear. So you want to consider something that's real. What's the real issue or concern that we need? What are people going to be passionate about? Because that's how people will come to the open space in the first place. It needs to be clear, avoiding jargon, concise, and understandable by all. So if you're writing a theme and only county people will understand it, or only community advocates will understand it, it won't serve either of them in terms of coming together in a diverse conversation. It needs to be positive and forward-thinking. The open spaces are not about a complaining session. Again, they're not brainstorming. They're about coming together to solve things in a collaborative way. It really helps to take your time on this. I've been in situations where we've taken several weeks and sometimes a month of ongoing conversations with different people to pilot test the theme, to discuss whether it really matters, to discuss whether our community is really passionate about the theme. Thinking about that theme and is next to deciding whether open space matters to you and whether you need the open space is probably the next biggest important thing, is what is that theme to be. Now, the givens. This is a part of open space that some people might see kind of anti-open spacey, if that makes any sense. But it's the reality check that you'll have a sponsor, and the sponsor may be an organization, it could be a county agency, it could be an institution or a collaborative. But the givens acknowledge the fact that if the open space is being sponsored by a group or an organization, there's going to be some things that are possibly non-negotiables. Now, you do have to make sure you go through and decide whether open space is the appropriate technique, but once you decide that, whoever the sponsor is may want to say, here's some boundaries of things that we will or we're not going to discuss this time. You might discuss, for example, how do we know if people start going outside of our theme, how do we bring it back to that theme? Right? Those would be things like fence posts in terms of discussing what should be on the agenda in terms of conversation topics and what people may want to table for later. Signposts are areas that sponsors believe are of great importance for participants to consider while discussing the theme. So it helps sometimes to give people some ideas. You're not necessarily saying you have to talk about this, but you might say, given this challenge we've had over the last 10 years, we believe that ideas 1, 2, and 3 are something that we'd love to hear more about and see some innovation around, right? So some things that might guide the group in some way. And then what's next? It's critical both in the introduction and in the closing that we'll cover to think about how can you help the people who show up to the open space to know what's going to go forward. If it's to generate innovations for proposals for what should be done, how will it be prioritized? You don't want to have an open space that generates all these wonderful ideas and then people say, well, what happened to that? Or why did the sponsors decide to do this versus that? We never really talked about that. It's hard to re-engage people in another open space or have that trust in your community if you don't fully articulate what's the process going to happen in terms of after the open space. It helps to, if there are any formal boundaries, it helps to express those in the invitation so people aren't surprised when they come there that they think they're going to be talking about one thing, but they're not. When determining what the givens are, it's really important to talk to the sponsor organization in advance. This is where sometimes you produce something for the LE team, and then people will say, well, what was the point of that? It didn't make any sense. So it really helps to think about what are the boundaries in some ways and what you want to discuss. Be prepared to use other facilitative methods when sponsors, when determining the given. So in terms of discussing what are the boundaries and what are some things that you don't want to do or you want to get out of this, Obviously, having more than one conversation helps, but thinking of how do you squeeze that information out of the sponsor. It is difficult, depending on what your role as a facilitator are. Some of you on this conversation today, you might actually be a facilitator within the sponsor organization. So maybe you have a really good idea of what the sponsor wants. But if you're not, or if you're thinking about a broader collaborative process, it's important to think of what are going to be some of those parameters that'll help keep our open space moving along the way we'd like it to. Inviting the attendees. So we all know how to invite people to a party, and that's generally what the invitation process is like. It should be open. It should be friendly. It needs to be something that doesn't say well, only certain people can come, obviously, but people should know if they're going to come or not based on the topic, the theme, and probably what the givens are. So your invitation should be open and not closed, but based on how you describe it, certain people may or may not decide to come. It really helps to pilot test the invitations and the approach. So if you're going to say we're going to use a telephone tree or direct marketing for this or the internet or whatever, whoever the core team is, the sponsor and others that are deciding on this invitation process, it helps to try out the language on people and see if it really does communicate and if people are getting some strange vibes or biases about what this is and what this isn't. The community bulletin board. So once you're in the open space and having that large area for the agenda, one thing that happens is that people decide to nominate things or talk about things that are not sessions and they don't want to do a session about. So it helps to have another place in the room. Sometimes it's called the newsroom or a bulletin board where people can just go write ideas of what's coming up. Oftentimes you'll have your butterflies doing that very well, where they might decide on something that they learned that's a broader topic. They don't want to do a session on it, but they have a community bulletin board. Maybe there's things that haven't been talked about, and you want to just say that we didn't talk about this today, but I sure was expecting it in this open space. The newsroom. Okay, let me take a break for questions there. Any questions?
This is Christy, and I'm not seeing any hands being raised at this point.
Okay, well, we're going to our last part. It's 11 o'clock, so I wonder if I've either put everybody to sleep or maybe they got scared away. So you think they're still there, Christy?
It appears that they are.
Okay, they might just be butterflies in this situation.
Exactly.
All right, so keeping the space open. Fairly simple, but your role as a facilitator is probably dominated after the open space gets launched. It's probably dominated by this idea of keeping that space open. And let's talk about what may happen here and what might also get in the way. So besides picking up the cups and moving the chairs and making sure people have coffee and water, it's important to look for certain kinds of things that are happening in terms of the openness of the space, other than the physical openness of it all. And that's generally people who might be what some may call space invaders, people who don't feel comfortable enough with the process and they feel like they have to control it in some way. For some of you that were at the kickoff open space, you may have seen some of that behavior happening. If you're the facilitator and you might want to include more people than just yourself at the large open space to be able to walk around the different discussions and look for that. So you're not looking for bumblebees or butterflies in this situation, but you're looking for people who are either dominating the conversation, are not taking the time to listen to others, and may actually start saying, look, we got to do this way and we don't have to talk about it anymore. Remember, that's not the point of open space. So if you find those kinds of people, it's not your role to become a bulldog and attack. Not likely to help what's going on. But you do have a role as a facilitator to say, acknowledge what the idea is the person is saying, make them understand that it is valuable because it's in the spirit of open space, but it may be important to also remind them of the law of 2 feet. If they don't feel like they're getting this group to understand them and maybe move in the direction that they're very passionate about, they might decide to go to a different session. And there's also, of course, the danger that everyone should be always reminded of, because it is one of the more difficult things to get into the open space, is the law of 2 feet. I have seen sessions, and you will too if you do this, where if someone dominates the meeting, a session that someone is talking about, and people are feeling that they're not learning and contributing in that sense because someone's dominating it, you will see 3, 4, sometimes more people literally get up at the same time and very nonchalantly walk to the next session. And that speaks volumes about group dynamics and helping people understand that they really should be careful in how they take over the process, because that's not the point of open space. Now, if they do persist, it may be important for you to invite them to a conversation outside of the, either away from the session that they're in or outside the room if it's a closed room, and talk about what you'd like to see in terms of the group discussion as opposed to someone controlling the conversation. This may be something that requires a bit more advanced facilitator skills for those of you who may not be open to talking to people who might be very controlling. So you may want to think about how you invite some people into your open space that will take that on. Ideally, though, if you set up this open space and you remind people of the law of 2 feet, the group will do that by moving on to something else and leaving the controller alone. All right, so now let's talk about bringing it all together and closing it. You've done this open space. People have convened. They've gotten their golden nuggets. There's a lot of ideas that are there. Depending on if you go for a full day or 2 days, you're going to have a lot of ideas on your bulletin board. Things will be typed up. There'll be innovative things and things you've never thought about before. But now you want to think of how do you bring it all together in order to create some meaningful next steps. And most of the open spaces will have this convergence, this process of bringing it all together, both for the people who are there, because it's important to feel that sense of closure, but also for the book of proceedings. So when you're sending out the notes, people can know, what did we talk about and what's the next step? Some examples. So the assumption here is that you've generated a lot of solutions and they're printed out. And if there are a lot, before the group leaves the open space, it helps to do a common method of putting them up, having people read through them, and then prioritizing them. So you might do the very basic technique where people will get some stickers, dots, or whatever they may be, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to a person. And the idea then is to spend some time reading and reflecting and nominating and prioritizing what you want to see. Many of us in the process, if you were at any of the regional Heli meetings, you did the sticker prioritization part. So you might present a few of these verbally if to honor sort of the hard work that's been going on and what people have contributed. And then the main thing is allowing people with time to read through what were some of the reports and what were some of the topics that were covered relative to the theme. That could take a half hour, that could take an hour, that could take an hour and a half. So if you've done a day-long session or 2-day session, you want to make sure you leave enough time for people to be able to reflect. This is different than sending out the notes after the open space and having people reflect on their own and possibly come back to some action steps. Very, very unlikely to happen, very difficult to happen unless you have full control of everybody in the room, which sort of goes against the open space. So the idea of the convergence and taking some time to reflect on what we actually produced in real time during the open space and prioritizing it is critical. So after the voting may be finished, you can look and see where people put the most stickers. You might pick the ones that had the most in terms of the session notes and put them in the middle of the room. And you might discuss the topics and say, these are the ones that seem to actually have the most energy among the people that were here. It doesn't mean that the rest of the things that we discussed in open space aren't going to be used. They're all urgent and important because that's what brought the passion of the people that worked in those sessions to put those things down. But you're trying to prioritize so people get a sense of what's going to happen next and what seems to be emerging as the top issues and ways that we want to move forward. The convergence idea re-emphasized to people that without passion and responsibility, you can't really do this. So you want to be thinking now of, after you've prioritized a few things, who in that open space is going to move towards action. Naturally, the people who had the conversations as hosts cared about it, but they may not be the best person to lead that topic or conversation in terms of next steps and taking action in the community. So now that you've prioritized them, you want to think of who in the room that we prioritize this will be able to move some of these things along. And it's a volunteer process. It's not what I think some of you in one of our regional meetings said the word is voluntold. So this is not a voluntold process, it's a volunteer process. And you're looking for what people in the room are passionate about moving forward. The champions will come forward, they would pick up a topic, they'd speak about it to the group out loud, so now they're in the middle of that circle. You want to remind the people in terms of the action plan that's about to be discussed, or at least some action steps, that everybody in the room really counts. That it's not about you being passive just because a few people stood up and said we'd like to lead this, but everybody in the room matters. And then once all the topics are selected and picked up, the groups will convene to fill out their action plan forms. Now this can be done outside of the meeting after you identified the champions. Some people do this action planning process as a separate part outside of open space. Many people, just because they know from experience that once people leave, it's hard to follow up, they'll do it during the open space. So the people who have nominated themselves and stood up as the champions for certain topics would complete a simple form like this in terms of who's participating, who's going to be joining them, what kinds of activities will they do to move this forward, and what would be a timeline. This is closer to an action plan. Again, people might do outside of open space, but it helps at least get those commitments before people leave the open space. Closing the circle. So now your open space is over. You've prioritized some of the main concerns. People have some idea of what might be coming up next. And this is where you bring people back to the circle that started it all. And the circle is a chance for people to see who is around. Some people may have left, and many of the open spaces that I've been part of, it's just surprising how many people stay for the full day, for a day and a half. They come back, especially if it's something that's a local issue that people can go back to their homes and come back the next morning. So now you get a chance to see who's around. People like to use a talking stick or some other type of form to recognize who's speaking so people aren't speaking over themselves. And you go around discussing what this process meant to you. And sometimes, depending on the group and how large it is, if you haven't done a formal action planning process, this is also the time when people get to say, here's a commitment I'd like to make in this open space. You don't have to say anything. You can pass on the commitments. But for people who are in the room around the circle who want to say something about what mattered and what they got out of this, and for the people in the room who actually say, I'm going to commit to doing this, this is your chance to actually do it around the circle. If there's a time limitation, as we talked about, the reality is that you might have a half a day or a day or so. You may want to say, look, we have 30 minutes to do this. We have 20 minutes to do this. So it might impede some people from talking because they realize they want to finish the conversation. But for many open spaces that have gone very well and there's a lot of excitement in the room, oftentimes you're trying to help people move along because everybody wants to say something. But you do want to make people aware of any time limitations if they exist. The book of proceedings is something that's happening live if you have laptops or computers there to type up the notes in real time. But this is now where you're actually putting everything together in one document, and that file can be sent to the sponsors, the participants, and ideally it's also put on the internet somewhere so people can see what was talked about, and it's a public document of what matters. Now, if you're doing this, as some organizations do, that they're creating innovations for proprietary products, obviously you're not going to see your open space online and widely distributed. So in our situation with the LE teams, these are public documents. We're trying to mobilize the community, so you might actually be able to put it on a Facebook or online. You do want to make sure everyone gets the book of proceedings of what happened and what people decided to do as the next step. In closing, just back to the whole idea. You don't do an open space if there's not a sense of passion and responsibility. It is an incredibly powerful technique that is driven by the concept of passion. What do you care about? What motivates you? How do you move along things that are difficult? And then a sense of personal responsibility for what you care most about, that you're actually going to volunteer and move things forward for the group, the LE team, your larger community, whoever you be working with. All right, so who's still with us? Can you tell Christy on the line?
Yes, sorry, was just unmuting myself. It looks like everyone is still here. So we can unmute as you might want in terms of folks to either respond to any questions that you have or questions that they might have.
So Monica has a question.
Yep.
Let me go ahead and unmute her. Okay, Monica, you're unmuted. Yeah. is that you may see on your control panel for the webinar that there's a tab that says audio. If you click on the diamond that's there or the triangle that's there. Okay, so Monica was just letting us know that she's still here. On there, if you use telephone, if you click on the circle that says telephone, it then gives you a phone number, an access code, and then a PIN, and you can call in using that, and then that allows us to let you speak a little bit more freely. I don't know if anyone else has a question. No hands raised, Steve, and no questions.
Okay, so here's where, in terms of next steps, I think probably the part I would love to hear from a few people of is, if you're going to do this, when? I mean, who on the phone feels that they can start this within the next month, within the next few weeks? If there's a way that we can maybe go from person to person and just give us a sense of timeline, and you could say, completely not sure or never. Definitely feel free to say that. So why don't we start with, if Monica's on the phone, and I don't see everybody on my end, Christina, so I'm not sure if you want to just go through one at a time and unmute them. And what you want to tell us is, when do you think you might actually do this? Best case scenario.
So Eric has a question for you, Steve, and his question is, are you aware of any open space gatherings in the near future that we can perhaps have an opportunity to participate and observe?
Well, it's a tough thing if there isn't someone that if you're not on someone's list to address a problem or concern. So it's like you wouldn't be invited to an open space if you're not important in terms of caring about the topic and being passionate about it. So there are open spaces that have been videotaped in part. There might be some that have been videotaped in whole, but they're long processes and it'd be hard to do the editing online. So you may want to look at some and see how they've been done. But other than attending a training, where during the training, when you're trained as a facilitator, you go through several open spaces. You go through the process of learning about it, facilitating one. It's a several-day training that you go through. Other than that, the open space that you would attend to watch would be a bit incompatible with open space, because you shouldn't be there if you're not contributing in terms of learning and moving that solution forward. So I don't know how that would work. I do know that there in the open space listserv, people are showing when they're doing their open spaces. Doesn't mean you can just show up, but there is an open space listserv that's fairly popular, and people can go on there and see who's doing what. But I don't know if you could just show up. But the videos might help.
So Steve, but you're not aware of any that are happening this summer in Merced?
Oh no, there are trainings that are happening this summer. I do know of trainings that are happening, and I'd be glad to send those as links. And usually they're going to be in Southern California or Bay Area. So, because that's where a lot of the organizations are that tend to use this for business purposes. As you can imagine, that's who ends up paying for these things. So I'd be glad to send the trainings out, and if people are more than welcome to go to the trainings.
Perfect. Then Monica says that they're considering doing this in August, so that would be Monica and Merced.
Okay.
And then Tina has said, I would hope that we could have one this summer or fall, but it may be too ambitious. I realize you've covered this a little, but what is the ideal size for an open space?
You know, it depends on what the theme is and what you're trying to solve, right? So you don't cancel your open space if a certain number doesn't show up, or if too many show up. So that's the other thing, which can be a problem. So depending on how challenging your theme is, so if you were going to choose something that may be only for service providers, and there's only going to be 30 service providers for your topic in the area that you think is very narrow, then your invitation may only go out to 30. So I wouldn't worry so much about size as much as connecting the size to the theme. So thinking of who would need to be invited to really fully address this topic. But there's no such thing as too small or too large. You'll see some people saying that you should have at least 10 or 20, but realistically, depending on the theme, you may not need 10 or 20. So you want to think of what is it we're trying to solve and how many people are out there that are passionate about solving this problem. That is what answers your question. So if you can just think of those people in your head of who you would invite, then that gives you a sense of the number of people. So Tina, does that give you, can you think of something in terms of a topic and just in your wild mind think of how many people do I think could get excited about that topic? What would that number be? Don't tell me the topic, just tell me the number.
We'll give her a second to type her question or response. 75. Do you think a venue with a capacity of 75 people is too small, though?
No, that's great. That's great. Super. All right, so Summer, and I think if you look at some of the other things online and see people doing this, you will be surprised that you can do this without training. I've been to open spaces where people were just literally did it themselves. They didn't get formal training, and it does work. It's not that complicated. The hardest part is really deciding on what the theme is, and I can help you with the themes as you come up with them. So in terms of the actually organizing the time and the location, many of you on the phone already have experience in doing events. So if you need help deciding on the theme and how to balance the theme with the number of people and the amount of time, I'd be thrilled to help you there if it would allow you to move further along. But again, not to speed the process, but I definitely don't want you to feel like you need tons of training to do this. It does work. Who else is on the line in terms of when they'd like to do this?
Tina says, great, thanks, Steve.
Okay. I've got Eric.
We have Eric on the line who was asking if there was a place where he could observe. We still have Janice on the line from Tri-City. Monica, who says that Merced will be trying this in hopefully August. We also still have Cora, who's also part of that Merced team. And then we also have Lupe, who's sitting in for Janet. And then Tina.
Great. Well, that may be it. I'm trying to think of, other than the most important thing for me in terms of next steps is timing. So I'd love to be able to, the folks that want to do something in August, Merced, or summer, I'd love to get together with you by phone and, Merced in person since I'm here, and, just create a little timeline and just move it along and see what you can get out of this. After you do one, you might decide to do, another one fairly soon. It depends on, what you like and what maybe you need more time to reflect. So the other folks who are on the phone, think about it, and I think in terms of next steps, that would be important to me personally, is to get a sense of how fast you'd like to act. And then also, if you're struggling, if this seems overwhelming, but it seems like something you want to do, but you're just still not sure, definitely feel free to pop me some notes or talk to Christy and Christina if there's something you think you want to talk to them about, how you do this. But we're here for problem solving to help you move this along if you think this is a tool that might fit. And maybe it's just having a conversation that you have an idea of what you want, and I can help you decide whether open space is or is not the right tool. So I'd be glad to help with that kind of a conversation as well. But moving it along is good, because oftentimes the trainings, these kinds of webinars, it's just they disappear from our minds so quickly. Christy, Christina, anything that you're going through your mind that you think could be helpful to the group in terms of moving them to do this next, if they'd like, of course? So it is optional.
Or Will, if you have any comments, Will.
No, good.
No, I think this has been really comprehensive, Steve, in terms of thinking about the ways in which folks could use this technology and use it with the theme, which I hope would be connected to their aim and, to the work that they're doing with their communities and with their initiatives that they're developing. And I like that you've offered some extra support if folks want and need it. So I think one of the questions I have that you've spoken to a little bit, and it, of course, impacts people beyond those who are on this call right now. But it's just related to, you know, the work that we did collectively, those of us who were present at the kickoff, and wondering if you have any suggestions about how to create those.
So on the kickoff, the open space we did for the kickoff, many of you may have already seen the notes for that, and I'm glad that we had that topic. It probably may have been a little biased because I'm an evaluator and researcher, so the topic we had was, you know, moving from evaluation to action. So I do worry that it may have been influenced disproportionately by what I was thinking, but I do feel it wasn't completely, because we had a conversation the day before of what people care about. I may have framed it a bit, maybe more specifically, but we have a whole bunch of ideas and things that people talked about. And the kickoff open space that we did, if you were part of it and you see the notes, you probably are seeing some things that don't work well if you don't allow enough time and sort of the process to work out. But we do have quite a few ideas of what people might want to do around their data and in terms of engaging the community around certain problems. And some of the themes that were discussed during this overall broad topic of moving evaluation to action don't directly have anything to do with that theme. So there's things about measurement and data and diversity being involved in measurement issues and culturally appropriate measures, but there's also themes that came up, conversation topics that came up that really are not about evaluation and data specifically, but more about the capacity for the community to take action. I think some people during the open space focused more on how do we take action and not as specifically as to how do we use data and measurement and move it to action. So you can see where that theme may not have been as clear and not as easy to understand what you would talk about. So that made a little more sense to me in terms of seeing things that didn't fit exactly into what I believe that theme was. And also my role as a facilitator of not going around enough to all the different conversations to see if they were on task with the theme. So we have commitments, though, of what people are planning on doing, and those commitments are likely to fit very well with what each of your teams is going to do, even if those commitments were made with by people who are outside of your HELI teams. So I'd encourage people to look at those commitments that were made during the kickoff from the entire group, because those commitments are about what things are people are trying to do to take action in some way, and they might be relevant to your HELI team's aim, even if the commitment was made by someone outside of your HELI team to a different county. For us as a group, myself and probably other of the larger HELI team members, we will be following up to see how are those commitments playing out and what kinds of opportunities exist on the evaluation and measurement coaching that you're going to get to try to make sure that your data and your results and what you identify in terms of disparities actually moves you towards some decisions and actions and not just stuck into looking at data for data's sake. So that's something that will be helpful from that portion of HELI, which is the evaluation and measurement coaching. Any questions around that?
Yeah, so not seeing any questions at this point. Yeah, not seeing any questions coming up at this point.
It may be time for a virtual lunch.
Maybe, or a real lunch.
All right, well, I guess we will be putting this up so people who aren't here can listen to it. And then I think I'll probably be following up with some of you. Again, no obligation to do it, but since you were on the call, you know, I'll probably send you a note just to see what you thought. And there is a little evaluation that we have too. Christy, is that right?
Yeah. So as people disconnect from the call, you'll probably get an email that's going to say it's from Tiffany Noble, I believe, but that's going to ask you, or it might be from GoToMeeting, I'm not sure, but we'll ask you to complete just a very short evaluation and give us some feedback about today. So the other thing I would just mention, you guys have been getting emails from us, and you will continue to get them, but while we have you on the line, we just wanted to remind you that we have another optional webinar that will be offering specifically that's related to the PDSA cycle and applying change in terms of the learning process, which we introduced during the kickoff in June. And so that next webinar will be on Friday, July 19th from 10 to 12. And again, you'll get additional information related to that. But we want to remind you guys as well to continue to access the website. We'll be continuing to add information and details there, but on that website you can find, in addition to the information hard copy that you received at the kickoff, you can find all the PowerPoints, and specifically what I'm referring to those is the calendar of activities, upcoming activities for the project. So.
And we do have a question from Tina. And the question is, thank you all. This is all so exciting.
Thanks, Tina.
Cool.
And I have a question for the group. My question is, would it be helpful for us to spend a little time or maybe do a webinar 101 with folks? If that would be helpful, please let us know. We'd love to be able to help you out with some of the audio so that there's a little bit more participation and dialogue. And I also want to be respectful of the fact that some of you are just happy listening, and so that's okay too, but we want to make sure that we can help you. And so we discovered too that part of Monica's problem may have been that her BlackBerry was next to her phone, and so the BlackBerry has superpowers that impeded her from being able to talk. So I'm actually going to unmute you for a second and see if relocating your BlackBerry allows you to speak. Hi, Monica. Okay, that still didn't work. So please let us know if that's something that you're interested in. We'd love to be able to help you. I think the most effective way to make webinar work is if you don't use your computer for communicating through, so not using the speakers and the mic. And some of you may or may not know whether or not you have a built-in microphone. And so that may also be a problem.
Okay. Well, so we won't apologize, Monica. We're glad that you're here and that you're emailing and chatting with us and still able to participate at that level, but sorry that, we can't hear you, your voice, but hope that we're communicating enough on your behalf. So I think, though, with that, maybe being the last question and Steve having gotten through all of his material, we can go ahead and instead of doing virtual lunches, we can start our lunch a little bit early today. So thank you guys for joining us. We will be in touch about things moving forward, and as has been mentioned numerous times, if you have questions, need any support or consultation, let us know. So thank you. Bye-bye.